Beyond the Whirlpool by Tucker Waters. Prologue. The line of black ships advanced steadily closer. Two people, a woman and a man, stood at the edge of a sandy beach, watching, missing nothing. "Keep this safe," the man said, taking a green jewel from a chain around his neck and pressing it into the woman's hand. The woman looked down at it. The jewel seemed to glow in the night. "Never give in. This jewel is the key to hope." "King Xavier, I cannot accept this," the woman said, her green eyes glowing in the moonlight. "You will soon need its power. Keep it with you," he replied, as they turned back towards the approaching ships and the battle that was sure to come. Chapter 1. Truman biked toward the sandy beach, his brain full of excitement. His father, John Maxwell, was a well-renowned marine biologist. His father had moved the two of them to the island of Maui to study the marine wildlife in the area. Truman was an average-looking boy with black hair and an average tan complexion, with bright green eyes that were hinted in specks of blue. Truman's mother, Megan Maxwell, had also been a marine biologist. About 10 years earlier, she and her team were hired to investigate some strange reports of abnormal behavior of the marine wildlife in the same area. As the story goes, they had decided to take diving shifts. Megan had taken the first dive. She never came up. Once they realized that something was wrong, a few of her team members tried to find her. However, they never found any trace of her. It was assumed that Megan became too engrossed in her investigation to realize that she was running out of oxygen until it was too late. Truman pushed these troubled thoughts away. He had to admit it was slightly unnerving to be right near where his mom died. However, today was his 15th birthday, and he was going down in a submarine with his dad. Truman skidded to a stop at the end of the beach, latched his bike to a rail, and walked toward the old wooden dock where his dad was waiting. "Ready to go, kiddo?" his dad asked with a wink. "Are you kidding? I was born ready." "Hop on in, then," his dad said, getting into the sub as it bobbed up and down on the surface of the water. Truman eagerly crossed to the sleek yellow craft. It was called V6 Ocean Explorer, his father's greatest joy. As Truman climbed in, he couldn't help but wonder what adventures awaited him. Truman sat down in the chair next to his dad, who was beginning to steer the sub away from the dock. He looked at Truman with a mischievous grin. "To infinity and beyond," he said as they plunged into the blue-green depths. "Man, Dad, this is so cool," Truman said as he looked through the laminated glass windows. "Isn't it? Your mother and I always wanted to share nature's beauty with you." Truman saw a faraway look enter his father's eyes and knew that talking about his mother sent him back to some bittersweet memories. Truman looked out at all the wonderland around him, unsure of what to say. That was when he noticed something odd. Schools of fish were swimming in strange spirals, as if being pulled by some unknown force. Before he could mention it to his dad, water started to swirl around them, causing the sub to begin to swerve uncontrollably. Lights flashed, alarms sounded. "Dad, what's going on?" Truman said, unable to keep the rising panic from his voice. "I don't know. We must have come too deep. There's a strong current pulling us down," his dad said, shouting to be heard over the sub's distress alarms. As if in response, the sub swerved violently. Truman's safety belt busted as he was thrown against the wall and everything went black. Chapter 2. When Truman awoke, the chaotic spinning and swerving had stopped, replaced with an eerie stillness. Truman rubbed his head and got up, realizing with a jolt that the sub was no longer in the water. Bright sunlight shone through the windows, revealing a sandy beach. Beyond that, bright red cliffs stretched high into the sky as far as the eye could see. "Dad!" Truman exclaimed, rushing towards his father's unconscious body. A faint trickle of blood ran down from a large gash on his forehead. Truman's brain swam, wondering what to do. He didn't want to leave for fear that his father would need him, but he also needed to find help. Finally, Truman decided to go. Making sure his father was safe, Truman opened the submarine's exit hatch and ventured out onto this unfamiliar island. Painfully aware of how important it was to find help, Truman made good time down the beach, where he came upon a small wooden cabin with a whitewashed fence around it, in the middle of which there was a gate. Truman cautiously opened the little gate and stepped inside. A well-kept garden stood on either side of him, with a dirt path weaving its way through the jumble of vegetation. Truman followed the path, went up to the small steps leading to the door, and was about to knock when he hesitated. Was he really going to trust someone he didn't know on a strange island in the middle of nowhere? Then, concern for his dad made the decision for him, and he knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time.
"Hold your horses, I'm coming,"
said a grumpy voice from inside. The door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like a cross between an elf and a dwarf. He had short, stubby legs, a long gray beard, long elfish ears, and a round belly that almost busted the buttons on the faded blue pajamas that he was wearing.
"What are you doing waking decent folk up at this time of night?"
Truman chose not to mention that this was the middle of the day. Instead, he replied, "Can you help me? My dad's hurt." Instantly, the short, pudgy man snapped to attention.
"Where is he? How'd it happen?"
"He's still in the submarine," Truman said, pointing back the way he came.
"I'll be right back,"
the dwarf said, disappearing into the house. He reappeared a minute later wearing a pair of tightly fitted red overalls and a matching watch cap.
"Mary, we've got a little boy here that needs our help. Bring your medicine bag,"
he called over his shoulder. A moment later, a head appeared through the doorway. "What is it, Jerome?" an elderly woman asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Truman stepped in. "My dad was knocked out when we shipwrecked on your island. He looks pretty bad," he replied, uncertain. He wasn't quite sure how to describe the way they had come to this island. "I see," she replied, coming out into the open. She had long gray hair that was pulled back into a bun, bright blue eyes, and the same elfish ears as Jerome, which were punctuated well by the dark blue dress she was wearing.
"Well, what's your name, boy?"
Jerome asked as he began walking back toward the submarine. "My name's Truman," he replied.
"Well, good to meet you. I'm Jerome,"
the dwarf said, shaking hands with Truman. This was followed by silence, in which all that could be heard was the crunch of their shoes as they trudged across the sandy beach.
"What in tarnation is this contraption?"
Jerome exclaimed as they came up to the sub. "This is the submarine," Truman said, chuckling slightly.
"You riding this thing?"
Jerome said, walking around the machine in wonder. "Jerome, the boy's father is still hurt, remember?" Mary said with a small smile.
I'm coming,"
he replied, grumbling to himself. Truman opened the entrance hatch and went into the sub, followed by Mary and Jerome, while Mary began fussing over his father's unconscious body, checking his wounds, smearing oils and creams onto it, and who knows what else. Truman and Jerome sat down in the pilot and co-pilot's chairs in the front of the sub to talk. Jerome was still gazing around, saying,
"What does this here button do?"
so many times that it would take an hour to read it all.
"How exactly did you get here?"
Jerome asked, breaking out of his trance. "All I know is we were down in the water when all of a sudden the submarine started to swerve out of control. I got knocked out, and now I'm here."
"Interesting,"
the little man replied, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Where are we, anyway?" Truman asked.
"Well, you're on the island of Erion, you dope. Didn't you know?"
Jerome said, looking totally shocked. "Well, I'm still getting used to things around here," Truman replied, with a small shrug. "We're going to need to move him," said Mary, breaking into the conversation.
"We can't carry him back to the house. It's too far,"
Jerome said. "Maybe we can take him to one of those caves a little ways up the beach," Truman suggested, recalling a dozen of the caves where the beach and cliffs intersected. "Good idea. I'll go get some blankets," Mary replied, getting up to leave the sub. "Let me help," Truman offered. "Well, why, thank you, young man," Mary said, stepping onto the sand. Truman quickly followed her, and together they walked back to the house. The inside was comfortably furnished. It had dark wood walls, a wooden floor, and in the middle of the room was a table. A candle sat on the table. A book sat next to it, its cover illuminated by the candle's soft glow. The Three Musketeers. Mom used to read that to me when I was little, Truman thought. The blankets aren't here, Mary said, jerking him back to the present. Truman crossed the room to an old closet where Mary was standing, and together they began digging through an assortment of blankets and sheets that were kept there. Before long, they both emerged from the house, each carrying an armload of brightly colored bedding.
What took you so long?
Came Jerome's voice when they got back to the sub. Oh, Jerome, we had a lot of stuff to get, Mary said, batting her husband with a pillow.
Hey, Jerome exclaimed, startled.
I've got to get these blankets ready. You boys get ready to move 'em, Mary said, gesturing towards Truman's father. Will do, Truman said. As Mary left the sub, Jerome, still sour from getting smacked with a pillow, got up from where he'd been sitting, and without any enthusiasm at all, said,
How do you want to do this?
You take one side and I'll take the other, Truman said, questioningly, crossing to the exit hatch and opening it.
That'll work,
Jerome replied, stepping over to the right side of Truman's dad, while the boy took the left side. Together, they lifted him and began moving him toward the open exit hatch. Careful, Mary said, as Truman and Jerome slowly carried Truman's father toward the cave.
Good grief, that was a workout,
Jerome said after they laid Truman's dad down. Oh, stop your fussing, Mary said, checking John Maxwell's pulse. You might as well make yourself comfortable. We'll probably be staying here for the night, Mary said with a small smile at Jerome, who promptly got up with a huff and walked off toward the house. Don't mind him, Truman, Mary said, while smearing oils and herbs on his father's wounds. His bark is worse than his bite.
I'm going fishing. Want to come along?
Came the voice of Jerome from a little ways behind him. Truman turned to see the little round orph trudging up from the beach, fishing pole in hand. Sure, Truman said excitedly. But what about Dad? Don't worry. He'll be here when you get back, Mary said with a reassuring smile. So, after hesitating for a moment, Truman got up and walked over to Jerome. The two of them walked in silence down the edge of the beach. Once they got there, Jerome casually threw his line and began fishing. Closer up, Truman realized Jerome's pole was made out of some sort of bamboo. It was green, but it had a brown, almost rusty look to it. Where exactly is Erion? Truman asked. Jerome gave him a sigh.
Erion is actually a group of 7 different islands. This island, technically, is the capital island, so it claimed the kingdom's name. Ever since King Xavier died, though, the islands have sort of separated and ruled themselves. Just then, a fish tugged on Jerome's pole. We got a big one, Jerome said, pulling it out of the water with lightning quickness. Wow, that was so cool, Truman said with amazement. Here, Jerome said, handing him the fish. Truman looked at him in confusion. Put it in the sand, Jerome said, laughing. Why? Truman asked, still confused. The sand here is rich in salt. It'll preserve it until we're done fishing. Oh, Truman said, nodding and burying the fish. Before long, they were headed back up the beach with a whole string of fish. Supper's here, Jerome said, holding the fish triumphantly as they came into the cave. I'll go get some firewood, Truman said. We have some in front of the house, Jerome replied. Roger that, Truman said, walking down the beach. Truman was almost to the house when the orange ray of the setting sun reflected off something floating in the incoming tide. Truman went over and picked it up. It was a faded photograph depicting a family of 3. There was something familiar about it, but it was too faded to know anything for sure. Truman put the photo in his pocket, picked up the wood from the house, and then headed back to the cave. That evening, they all had a delicious fish dinner. Although she ate, Truman noticed that Mary never left his father's side. Yum, yum, that fish was good, Truman said, yawning. Jerome, I'm going to need more cockle-flower poultice for the wound, Mary said, with a note of concern entering her voice. Is he going to be all right? We'll get some more cockle-flower poultice in the morning. He'll be all right, Mary responded, smiling reassuringly. With that, Truman uneasily gave in to the warm embrace of sleep. Up, 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 it's breakfast time,
came the voice of Jerome, breaking into Truman's delicious slumber. Truman groaned and rubbed his eyes and got up to the smell of fresh fish
being cooked over the fire. Soon they were eating a delicious breakfast.
"Jerome, he's worse," Mary said, anxiously feeling Truman's dad's forehead.
"Come on, Truman," Jerome urged, throwing his plate down and rushing out of the cave. Truman followed as quickly as he could. They rushed across the beach, this time in the opposite direction they had come, until they reached a cabin. The cabin was similar to Jerome and Mary's, only bigger. Jerome smashed through the cabin's gates and stormed up the steps, yelling, "We need cockleflower poultice! We need cockleflower poultice!"
"Who's hurt?" came a voice inside.
"This boy's father," Jerome said urgently.
Then the door opened, and to Truman's astonishment, out stepped a ghost from the past. "Mom? Mom?" Chapter 3. "What?" the medicine woman said, her green eyes searching his face. "Truman? Is that you?" Truman's mother said, brimming with hope. "Yes, Mom, it's me," Truman said, hugging his mother hesitantly, more than a little shocked by her miraculous reappearance. "I thought I'd never see you again," his mother said, tears streaming down her cheeks.
"Megan, I hate to ruin the moment, but as I recall, this boy's father is hurt pretty bad,"
Jerome said, clearing his throat to get her attention. "Right," Megan replied, going back into the house. She returned a moment later holding a black medical bag with the words "First Aid" emblazoned in bright red lettering across the front. Property of Maxwell Marine Biology Team was printed in slightly smaller blue lettering on the lower left-hand corner of the bag. That made Truman smile. With that, the three of them set off back toward the cave. When they arrived, Mary was frantically trying to treat John Maxwell's wound, which looked purple and infected. "Megan, I'm so glad you're here." "How is he?" Megan asked, the concern evident on her face. "His fever is up. I've done all I can without cockleflower poultice," Mary replied. "That's all we can ask for," Megan said, bending down to check her husband's wound. "So how did you get here, Truman?" his mother asked, taking a jar of some yellow stuff out of her bag and smearing it on his father's head. "Well, it's a long story," Truman replied, hesitantly. He still wasn't quite sure how to explain it. "I'd love to hear it," his mother said, smiling at him. "Okay," Truman said, shrugging. With that, he began recounting their mysterious journey. His mother would smile, using a white cloth to cool her husband's forehead as she listened. However, when Truman mentioned the Whirlpool, her head snapped up. "You came by the Whirlpool?" she asked, casting a quick, worried glance at Jerome, who was sitting cross-legged. "Yeah," Truman said, nervously. He was a little bit taken aback by his mother's reaction. "Is everything okay?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course," his mother said, regaining her composure. "That should do it," she said, finishing her treatment of her husband's wound. "Would it be all right if I spent the night here?" Truman's mom asked. "I'd like to be here if anything goes wrong." "Fine by me," Truman said with a smile. His mother returned the smile and then said, "Jerome, could you help me get some things from my place?" "Sure thing," Jerome said, getting up from where he'd been sitting. The two of them headed back in the direction of his mother's cabin. There was something in the look that passed between them. It was an anxious, almost worried look, which made Truman feel uneasy, as if there was some hidden menace that he was unaware of. Truman tried to walk away his worries, heading off across the beach towards his mother's house. His mother and Jerome were a little ways ahead of him. They appeared to be talking earnestly to one another, the concern evident on both of their faces. Truman sped up a little bit so that he could hear what they were saying. "He's come back, Jerome. I can feel it," came Megan's voice full of concern.
"We fought him off before, and we can do it again," Jerome said determinedly.
"We must prepare," Truman's mom replied. "Could you and Kilgore meet me here tonight?"
"Will do. I'll go over to his place right after we drop off your stuff at the cave,"
Jerome responded, closing the door as he spoke. Truman turned and slowly began walking back to the cave, his mind full of questions. What were they preparing for? Why were they afraid? He would find his answers that night. However, when he was almost to the mouth of the cave, he had a sudden flash of insight. He ran to the submarine and climbed in, where he began searching through the many drawers that lined the sub's walls. His father kept a notepad in a bag. "Bingo," Truman thought, triumphantly pulling out the small white notepad and a pencil. Then he got out of the sub and ran back to the cave, where he began drawing the scenery around him. Moments later, Megan and Jerome arrived, their arms full of bedding. "What are you doing, Truman?" asked Megan as she set up her palette. "Well, I've never been here before," replied Truman, "so I thought I might draw the island." "Nice. It's pretty, isn't it?" Megan said while looking out in the distance. "It sure is," Truman replied, noticing for the first time how late it was. The sun was beginning to set over the beautiful landscape. "Looks like it's time to hit the hay," Truman said, hoping he didn't seem too eager.
Good idea, Truman, Jerome said, tossing him an extra blanket. Truman laid down to where he was facing away from the others and waited for darkness to fall. Chapter 4. Truman awoke with a start. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. He turned over and noticed his mother and Jerome were gone. Mary laid asleep against the wall of the cave. Truman got up as quietly as he could and began walking toward his mother's house. The darkness around him seemed to foreshadow some unknown doom. When Truman arrived, he circled around to the side of the cabin where he found a window. "Like I said before, we've stopped him and we can do it again," came Jerome's voice from inside. "I know, Jerome, and I thank you for your bravery. However, he may have gotten stronger," whispered Megan. "What would you like me to do?" came a new voice that Truman had never heard before. "Well, I suppose the first thing we need to do is alert everyone," Megan replied. Truman peeked in and could see their faces in flickering candlelight. "Kelgor, can you alert the dwarfs?" "You can consider it done," replied a short man with a red beard and what looked to Truman to be a Viking helmet. "Jerome, can you start working on the catapults?" "It's been a while. I may have lost my touch, but I can try," Jerome replied. "What about the Sky Warriors?" Kelgor asked. "I think I could get word to them," Megan replied. "Raybolt!" "What?" A quiet squawk sounded in the dark, out of which stepped a golden yellow shape, about the height of Truman himself. It had the head and wings of an eagle, while having the body of a lion. "I can't believe I'm seeing this," thought Truman in awe. Megan turned to a little wooden table in the center of the room, where she had a piece of partially carved wood and a carving knife. She took the knife and etched a circle with an X through it in the wood and gave it to the griffin. "Take this to the other Sky Warriors," Megan said. Raybolt responded with a short "Wah!" as if in understanding. "We should go. There is much to be done." With that, they headed through the door. Truman pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. The front door opened and all three people left. Raybolt took to the sky with the wood grasped firmly in his beak. Truman waited a few minutes, wondering what he'd seen. Could that have been a real griffin? How was his mom connected with this? And why did she not want him to know what was going on? However, Truman quickly pushed these thoughts away and onto a different problem. His excuse for being out this late. He went down to the shore where he picked up a couple of elaborate colored seashells. One was white with specks of red peppering its smooth surface. Another was a bright turquoise with a hint of green. But when he reached to grab the shell, the tide rushed in and obscured it from view. Once the ocean receded, Truman went over to pick it up, realizing for the first time it was a stone, with the blue-green colors of the sea seemingly flowing through it. Above it there was an inscription in the sand, which read, "The key to hope you do not have, but if a hero you wish to be, then take this stone from the sea." "Awesome," Truman said to himself, and reached to put the stone in his pocket. But the moment that Truman touched it, the whispers of the past unknown enveloped him. Truman saw his mom's younger self coming out of the water in full scuba gear, looking tired and confused. Then he saw a man flanked by two knights wearing shining golden armor come down to meet her at the edge of the beach. The vision blurred and flew to a different scene. He saw Jerome and Mary, both younger, sitting in their cabin, talking with a man that Truman had seen earlier in the vision. "Are you familiar with the legend of the Whirlpool, Jerome?" the man asked. "No, sir," the orc replied. "The story goes that there is a mysterious portal that leads to a different world. The scrolls say the Whirlpool will bring the person worthy of the key to hope. She may not know it, but I think this woman that just arrived may be that person." "What's her name?" Jerome asked. "Megan. In fact, I was wondering if you could help me build a cabin for her." "Yes, King Xavier," Jerome said, bowing slightly. "Thank you, my friends," King Xavier said, a kind smile appearing on his light-tanned face. Chapter 5. "Where have you been?" Truman's mom asked. "Out for a walk," Truman replied, keeping his voice as normal as possible. "Check this out," he said, handing her the speckled stone he'd found. "The interest in nature must run in the family," she said, smiling. "How's—" Truman's voice was cut off by the sound of a raspy cough. "Mary, he's waking up," Megan said urgently. The elderly orph came over and began checking on John Maxwell's pulse. "You may want to move away, Megan. We don't want to send him into shock," Mary said. "Okay,"
Megan replied, ducking out of the cave. "Truman?" came his father's weak voice. "Right here, Dad," Truman replied, coming to his father's side. "What happened?" John asked softly. "It's a long story, but we're safe now," Truman said, smiling. "Who are these people?" Truman's dad asked, noticing Jerome, who was standing against the wall of the cave, drawing something on what looked like a piece of brown parchment. On the other hand, Mary busied herself by checking John Maxwell's head wound. "I'm Jerome," the orph said, looking up from his drawing. "I'm Mary," she said, smiling down at the wounded man. "Good to meet you," John Maxwell said, coughing as he spoke. "You better rest now," Mary said, smiling kindly down at him. "We can trust them. You need to rest," Truman added. With that, John Maxwell gave his son a weak smile, which eventually gave way to sleep. "Mom?" Truman said, leaving the cave. "Right here, Truman," Megan responded, barely visible in the shadows at the edge of the beach. Truman crossed the beach to her and looked out over the ocean. "Are you doing okay?" Truman asked. He'd noticed that tears were glistening in her eyes. Megan sighed and looked at her son. "Truman, there are things that you don't know," her voice trailed off. "Like what?" Truman pressed. "Ordinarily, you and your father coming here would have been the most wonderful surprise in the world. But of all the times to come, why now?" She trailed off again, her face a mixture of sadness and worry. "What's going on?" Truman asked. "I'll tell you when the time is right. For now, we better go to bed." Truman smiled and went back to his pallet in the cave. He wasn't quite sure how to feel about suddenly having a mom. That being said, she was nice, and it was obvious that she loved him, so that was enough for him. However, there were still so many questions. What had he seen in the vision just hours before? What had happened to cause her to be afraid to tell him anything? However, the biggest question of all, what was it that was coming that was causing all this fear? Truman laid awake pondering questions, but to his surprise, it was in his sleep that he found answers. Chapter 6. Truman was dreaming, and he knew it. Whether or not it was a vision, he didn't know. Unlike his other dream, he could not hear anything. He saw a cabin being built that looked like his mother's. Next, he saw a man who he now knew as King Xavier sitting across from her at a table examining some old scrolls. The scrolls appeared to be made of dark brown, weather-worn parchment. When all of a sudden, a man with hard, dark features and an intense, almost searing gaze loomed in the doorway. Although Truman could not hear his words, he could feel the fierceness of the conversation. As if something snapped, swords were drawn, and he could imagine the echoing ring of steel on steel. Fear rippled through Truman's body as the duel continued on and on. Back and forth they went, both men showing their skill. With bated breath, he watched the dark stranger pin the king to the ground and raise his sword to strike the fatal blow when the king, in a desperate attempt to save his life, pulled a green jewel amulet from a chain around his neck and held its brilliant green surface up to the light. The dark stranger staggered back, as if struck, crumbling to his knees before the king. Although immobilized, the ardent hatred and anger boiled in the stranger's piercing black eyes, making Truman's skin crawl. Two knights, clad in armor polished so bright they glowed like gold, escorted the dark stranger, now in chains, from the room to an uncertain fate. The images before Truman's eyes blurred and faded till all of a sudden he realized, with the clash of swords and the cries of angry men, he was looking down from a high cliff upon a great battle being waged on the beach below. As the battle raged on, the waves lapped at the shore and slowly turned red with spilt blood. At that moment, Truman realized that the two men fighting in the midst of the fray were familiar to him. It was once again King Xavier and the dark stranger fighting for their lives. Sparks flew as iron struck iron in their frenzied struggle to overpower their opponent. It was obvious that some time had passed between the two visions, for the years had not been kind to the king's body. Though he still fought with skill, his blows became weaker, his movements labored, and his hands shook. Sensing the king's weakness, the dark stranger struck with merciless tenacity and vengeance until finally it grew too much for the old king to bear, and knocked his sword skidding across the sand. In one deft motion, the stranger plunged his sword deep within the king's chest, piercing his heart. For an instant,
everything stood perfectly still. And then it happened. The piercing "Bwah!" of a griffin reverberated down the cliffside. Truman's mother came flying into view atop the awe-inspiring creature. In her hand was the king's green jewel, and as she neared the battle, she held it up before the others, pointing it towards the water. The blood-stained water began to boil, then churn, then swirl until a giant whirlpool began spinning, plunging the ocean's depths into its middle, creating a hurricane-like shape of water and sand. The army of Erion, enraged by the death of their king, charged forward with renewed vigor, forcing the dark stranger and his black-clad warriors back towards the swirling chasm of water. As the panic-stricken enemy struggled to keep from being sucked into the mouth of the churning whirlpool, Truman saw his mother move out of the corner of his eye. Whatever she had done suddenly caused the whirlpool to cave in upon itself and disappear, burying their enemies within its depths. Chapter 7. Truman woke just as the black sky of the night was giving way to the pale blue of early morning. He got up and left the cave, careful not to wake the others. His dreams from the previous evening had left him disturbed. What did it all mean? Who was this dark stranger, and was he the cause of the evident recent distress? "Truman?" a voice called from the cave. Truman turned to see his dad standing at the entrance of the cave. "Dad, what are you doing up?" he cried, running over to hug him. "Whatever that lady has been putting in that poultice has done wonders for my sore head. Have you figured out where we are yet?" Struggling to contain his excitement, Truman answered, "Kinda, sorta. We're on an island that is apparently called Erion. As far as how close we are to our old world, I get the feeling we are now in a completely new one." He continued to catch his father up on everything that had happened while he was sick, except for the little tiny detail of his mother's miraculous reappearance after 10 years. Better to save that for when he was a little stronger. Looking around, his father exclaimed, "While I wouldn't have minded missing the bump on the head to get here, just imagine what we might discover in this new world." If he only knew, Truman thought. Despite his excitement, Mr. Maxwell was not thoroughly recovered, and soon he grew too tired to explore. When his father left him to rest in the cave, Truman hurried to his mother's cabin to share the good news. Finding the door slightly ajar, Truman slipped inside. His mother stood with her back to him. When she turned, tears glistened on her pale cheeks. "What's wrong?" Truman asked, walking over and putting his arm around her. At the question, Truman's mother trembled as if some ominous force was lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. She replied, "He's coming back, and this time I fear we won't succeed." "Who's coming back?" Truman asked, although something told him that it was connected to his visions. "King Xavier's brother, Prince Vernon. At the end of the First War, Prince Vernon was thrown into the whirlpool. However, I feel he's been plotting his revenge ever since." Truman was quiet for a moment. Could Prince Vernon be the dark stranger who had troubled him so greatly? "How long do you think we have?" Truman asked, coming out of his thoughts. "1 day, 2 at the most. One of our scouts spotted their ships." "How could they see them that far out?" Truman questioned. "We still have people that remain loyal on the other islands, though they are few and far between. Is your father well enough to see me yet? I need to share the news with him as well. Let us hope we will be ready." "I'll go get him," Truman replied, running out the door. "Here we go," Truman thought. "Dad!" Truman called, coming up to the cave at full speed. "What's up?" Mr. Maxwell said, sensing the urgent tone in Truman's voice. "We're in danger. Follow me. I'll explain on the way," Truman said, already turning back the way he'd come. "Where are we going?" Truman's dad asked, catching up to him at the still beach submarine. Truman reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded photograph that he'd found on that first night on the island. "Have you ever seen this?" Truman responded, handing him the picture with the small family. "Where did you get this?" Truman's dad asked, stopping in apparent shock, leaning against the side of their beach sub as he spoke. "On the beach when we first got here," Truman replied. "Amazing. What else do you know about this?" his dad responded, his shock giving way to wonder as he looked at the photo. "What do you mean?" Truman asked. "I gave this to your mother before her final dive. We both got identical copies," his father said, pulling out his wallet and showing Truman his copy of the photo. Truman nodded. "I wanted to be sure." "What are you saying, Truman?" "Well, Mom is—" His voice trailed off. Truman started walking again, unsure how to break the news.
"What about your mom?" his dad questioned, following him. Truman quickened his pace. The cabin was only a few steps away now. "Truman?" his dad pushed. Truman made it to the cabin steps. "I'll let her tell you herself," Truman said, as the two of them reached the porch. "What?" Mr. Maxwell exclaimed as Truman opened the door. Chapter 8. "Megan?" John said, his voice full of wonder. "It's been a long time, John," Megan said, a kind smile on her face. "But how? When? Where?" John questioned, sputtering in awe. "Come on in," Megan replied, ushering her husband into an old wooden rocker that sat against the far wall. Still astonished, Mr. Maxwell sat, eyes wide, and waited for an explanation. "See, it happened on the dive in Maui, the one I went missing on. I assume everyone has wondered what happened. When I went down, I was tasked with discovering what was causing a mass migration of fish to a central point in the ocean. What I found was that the fish were being slowly pulled there by the Whirlpool. However, as you can imagine, I found that out the hard way. When I came up in Erion, I was completely lost and confused. Much like you and Truman, I didn't know how to get back home, so I befriended the people here. King Xavier helped me make a home here and promised to do whatever he could to help me get home. Only, he always said, when the time is right. Now I understand what he meant. He started to show me some ancient scrolls that depicted the future of Erion. The scrolls showed that the Whirlpool would bring certain people that were destined to save this kingdom. That is when Prince Vernon began to grow angry. You see, when Xavier and Vernon were very young, their parents, King Stratton and Queen Hannah, decided to give the throne to Xavier, even though Vernon was the firstborn son. The story goes that King Stratton and Queen Hannah saw that darkness was depicted in Prince Vernon's future in the reflection of the royal jewels. After King Xavier shared the scrolls with me, Prince Vernon accused the king of sharing the royal secrets with outsiders and that he had betrayed the trust of Erion's people. Vernon traveled to all the different regions of Erion, creating unrest and stirring the people up, which caused an uprising. It was only a matter of time before the battle broke out. Prince Vernon came with all the forces he had gathered and laid siege on this island. King Xavier's loyal people rose up and stopped him. However, King Xavier lost his life. Prince Vernon was forced into exile along with his men inside the Whirlpool. Megan paused for a moment and looked at her husband thoughtfully. "However, I feel that when you and Truman arrived, he was accidentally freed and is on his way now." Mr. Maxwell stood up from where he'd been sitting. "How do you know he's coming, Megan?" "Our scouts spotted him about 2 days hard sailing away. I would love for this to be the happiest reunion ever, but there are a lot of stressful factors right now, as you can imagine." "I've grown to care for all the people here," Megan said. Her expression was the perfect mixture of joy and sadness woven into one. John crossed the room to stand beside her. "I understand, Megan, but when this is all over, we have a lot of catching up to do," he said, giving her a small smile. Truman said nothing, knowing this was a difficult time for both of them. The two of them went on to lighter topics, like how life was at home and what they had been doing over the last 10 years. Eventually, all three of them were smiling, feeling the comfort of the family being together again. They knew that it would be a while, if ever, that things could go back to how they once were. However, merely being in each other's company brought joy to all three. A short knock sounded on the door. Megan crossed the room and opened it. Outside stood a heavily built dwarf whom Megan had referred to as Kelgor during their mysterious nighttime war council. "John, this is General Kelgor," Megan said, introducing the two. "Good to see you, sir," Kelgor said, as the men shook hands. "Would you mind teaching these two a few things when it comes to swordplay?" Megan asked. "Do they know?" Kelgor questioned. "Yes, I just told them." "We want to help in any way we can," John put in. Truman nodded. "I'd be glad to, Megan," Kelgor said. With that, the four of them set off across the beach as Kelgor began inquiring as to their weapon of choice. Before long, Truman and his dad were learning basic techniques and preparing for the battle ahead. 2 days had passed since Megan Maxwell's foreboding message and the reuniting of their family that followed. All the work that had been secretly underway for some time now was now in the open. Every ounce of energy was focused on preparing for the battle ahead. Truman and his father's crash course with Kelgor had gone well over the past couple of days. Catapults were raised, barricades were made at intervals along the beach, heading up to the base of the mountain at the top of which Erion's ancient castle stood. There were even stacks of boulders that were held back by tree trunks that were reinforced by rope that could be cut in the event that the boulders needed to be used. Kelgor had received word from Raybolt that the Sky Warriors had been gathered from all over the island and were on their way. Truman might have been excited if his dreams had not been overshadowed by a dark presence. The one he now knew as Prince Vernon seemed to be trying to suck his newfound jewel away from him. The jewel's natural luminescence would flicker from time to time, but with each day he felt more and more like he was destined to do something special and that the jewel would be part of that. That evening, a horn sounded through the fog. It was the signal that they had been waiting for, the signal that Prince Vernon's fleet could be seen from their island. At the sound of the horn, Truman ran from the cave where he'd been sitting to the shore to see the doom that awaited them. A solid line of black ships advanced on the island, except there was something different about them. The sails were black as well, with a red X emblazoned across them. Quietly, his mother, father, Jerome, and Mary came up next to him. "It's time. Come with me," his mother said, speaking to all of them. They followed her in a tense silence to her cabin where, to Truman's surprise, Kelgor was already waiting. "Are the catapults ready?" his mother inquired, addressing Jerome.
"As you know, we've been working day and night. Our forces are ready."
"How about the snares?" she asked.
"Set all the way up the mountainside,"
Jerome said, allowing himself a small chuckle. "The archers are also ready atop the castle wall," Kelgor put in. "Plus, we have other sentries hiding slightly lower down that will retreat back to the castle if necessary." "Good," Megan said, comforting herself with this knowledge. "Can you spare any weapons?" John asked, addressing the general. "Yes, we have extra weapons," Kelgor replied. "You think you still have some of your football days in you?" Megan added, smiling. "I can try, but I think I'll need something a little more effective than a big-time tackle," John replied with a grin. Kelgor looked at Megan, who nodded. Stepping over to the wall, the warrior dwarf felt on the wooden planks until he found a certain board and pushed in. 2 boards began to separate, which yielded view to a door. Megan then stepped over and brought a green jewel from around her neck. Almost instantly, a similar-shaped outline began to glow in the center of the door. As soon as the jewel touched the glowing segment of the door, it opened, revealing shields and swords and even helmets without number. "Whoa!" Truman said. "No time for that," his mother said. "How much do you want?" she asked his dad. His father then responded by selecting a shield and a sword, along with a full suit of silver armor. His mother also selected a sword and shield that was painted red along the outside with a yellow interior. His father's was silver with a glistening sheen designed to reflect the sun's rays into the enemy's eyes. "Ready?" Megan asked, as the eerie warning of another horn sounded through the evening mist. As she spoke, Megan slipped her jewel into an opening on the hilt of her sword. The moment she did, the blade glowed green. "Stay here, Truman," Megan said, opening a trap door that had been concealed by a small rug. Truman was about to obey when something occurred to him. "Mom!" he exclaimed. "What about the sub?" "It's just another obstacle for Prince Vernon's troops. We should leave it," she responded in a grim tone. "Megan, you should stay back with Truman," John said. "If anything should happen to you after all these years, I don't know what I'd do," he continued, taking her hands in his. "People need me here," Megan said, gazing kindly into her husband's eyes. "I need you here," John Maxwell said, his voice choked with emotion. "I need you too. That's why we'll have to do this together," Megan replied, her eyes brimming with tears. "Get in and don't come out until it's safe," Megan said, pointing toward the cellar that was now visible. Truman did so and closed the door above him. The last thing he heard before his parents left was the scraping of the rug on the floor as it was moved back into place. Chapter 9. Truman waited, the silence speaking louder than he could ever imagined possible. Then, Truman felt a heat in the pocket of his jeans. The jewel, he thought, realizing it had been there the whole day. He took it out and studied it. Instead of the usual blue-green, the jewel turned yellow, then scarlet, a dazzling bright orange that resembled the sun, even a brilliant purple, with power coursing through it like tongues of flame. The old cellar radiated with the jewel's power. Light flew in every direction. With the whole display, Truman hardly noticed as the first battle cries rang out from beyond the walls of the now brilliantly illuminated cellar. Still more colors came, a solid bronze and a silver worthy of a knight's armor. Then the jewel flickered to blue, then green before coming to rest at its original color. As the brilliant swirl of changing colors died away, the sound of battle reached his ears. The ching-ching of metal on metal, sword on sword could be heard. However, the most distressing of all were the cries of agony as some unfortunate soldier met their death. Truman knew he had to help. Truman reached up to the trap door and pushed, forcing it open, sending his mother's wool rug flying across the room. He then ran over to the wall behind which the miniature armory was hidden. Great, Truman thought, feeling desperately for the hidden button on the wall. Board by board, he pushed with no reward. Finally giving up, he sat against the wall, painfully aware of his inability to help his friends. Then he dejectedly pulled out the jewel, feeling somehow he had failed it as well. All at once, he felt a heat behind his back. The carving hidden behind the wall began burning its shape through the layer of wood in a blue-green glow. The wooden planks began groaning and began to splinter. The stress became too much on the old cabin. The entire wall snapped in two. As the roof began following suit, Truman quickly put his jewel up against the door of the armory, unlocked it, yanked the door open, and ducked inside, leaving a pile of support beams, stone, and more rubble crashing down where he had just been. Truman was surprised that the armory had stayed intact, almost like a tornado shelter, he thought. Selecting a sword and shield out of the stockpile of weapons, Truman set his attention on finding a way out. All around him, sets of armor stood on their stands, lined up at attention against the wall. But that's all there was, 4 walls, weapons, and armor. How was he going to get out? As if in response, a particularly large set of armor began to glow as he looked at it. With a rumble, the floor shifted, causing the suit of armor to turn sideways, revealing a doorway. It appeared to be made of pure diamonds, sparkling as he tried the handle. It was unlocked, he thought, somewhat surprised. Even so, Truman had to put his shoulder into the door before it opened. The shifting of brush could be heard from the other side. With a grunt, Truman forced his way out into the open. Circling to the front of the cabin, he surveyed the scene before him. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Erion's people lay motionless, while a relentless sea of black-clad knights trudged mercilessly over them, seeking their next victims. Fury coursed through him as he charged at the enemy. An elf's shield shattered under the impact of a dark knight's blade, sending splinters everywhere. Truman rushed to his aid, catching the evil warrior by surprise and sinking his blade into his side. The elf was an archer. Truman realized by the bow he carried. The shield likely had belonged to a fallen comrade. He gave Truman a nod, and the two of them continued, slaying enemies as they went. A screech sounded overhead. Giant boulders descended onto the enemy, wreaking havoc on Prince Vernon's ranks. The Sky Warriors had arrived. Kelgor could be heard shouting orders as Erion regrouped behind wooden barricades that stood farther up the blood-soaked beach. The barricades formed a protective line along the base of the cliffs, from which archers could shoot at the oncoming enemy while maintaining the benefit of cover. Truman fell back along with the others. The elf he had befriended took an arrow from the quiver on his back, knocked it, and sent it flying, striking the nearest dark warrior in the chest, sending him toppling to the ground. Above, a cloud of arrows flew through the air, temporarily blocking the sun's rays from view. The arrows rained down on the dark ranks, causing chaos for the enemy. As the battle raged on, 2 ships hoisted giant wooden planks over their starboard side. Then 4 giant catapults were rolled onto the shore. Each one was wooden, lined with metal to protect it from arrows. All at once the enemy separated into 2, putting their shields over their heads so that many Erion arrows never found their mark. There was a moment of silence as the catapults advanced. High on the cliffside, a green sword raised high in the air and then came down. At the signal, Erion launched its own catapults, hurling colossal boulders into the air. The boulders crashed down on the scene below, forcing Truman further up the cliffs. An earth-shattering crash echoed from below. Truman looked back as the dust cleared on the beach. Still more dark warriors swarmed through the dust, beginning to climb up the cliff after them. At the same time, they released their catapults, sending boulders smashing into the castle wall. The tide of battle had turned in Prince Vernon's favor, and Truman knew it. Raybolt circled overhead, screeching defiance at the enemy. Raybolt swooped towards Truman as a dark warrior attempted to cut him down from behind. With a yell, the man shifted his attention to the griffin speeding toward him, claws outstretched. Truman moved quickly, turning and stabbing the man before he could harm Raybolt. Taking his crossbow, Truman did something he would never have thought possible. He jumped onto the griffin's back. They flew high in the sky, looking at the devastated battlefield below them. Then he saw Prince Vernon, an evil smile on his face. Behind him, Truman could hear the sounds of fighting on the castle wall. Raybolt seemed to know exactly where they were going, and so Truman turned his attention back to Prince Vernon. He lifted the crossbow and took careful aim. Closer, closer, closer. Prince Vernon seemed to feel their presence because as they flew closer, he looked up. Truman squeezed the trigger. Chapter 10. At the last moment before Truman's arrow streaked away, an archer from below shot Raybolt in the wing, causing them to crash to the ground and causing Truman's shot to thud into the ground at Prince Vernon's feet. Grunting with effort, Raybolt got back to his feet. He started to advance on Prince Vernon when a horn sounded. Erion had surrendered. Still he attacked, screeching in rage. Prince Vernon brought his hand forward, revealing a jewel as black as night. Raybolt collapsed at his feet. Prince Vernon drew his sword out of the dark cloak he was wearing. He raised the sword to strike down Raybolt, the light of the sun glinting off the menacing blade. Truman ran, blocking the evil prince's thrust just before it would have sank into the griffin's paralyzed body. Prince Vernon's face was that of hot anger as he stepped away to study this new opponent. Heedless of the fact that the battle had already been won, they circled each other, waiting to strike. Prince Vernon moved quickly, sending his blade in a deadly arc and aiming to end the boy in a single stroke. Truman, however, ducked his blade, thrusting his own sword out, aiming for the evil prince's legs. Astonished, Prince Vernon leapt backward in a last resort maneuver to avoid Truman's well-aimed stroke. He stepped back again, studying this boy who was now proving himself a worthy opponent. A boy, he thought, wondering where he could have found such skill. Of course, he knew that by using his jewel, he could end the boy in moments. However, such a skilled swordsman might prove himself useful if he were turned. Bearing Prince Vernon's dark jewel in mind, Truman turned on the offensive, lashing out with both sword and shield. Right hand, left hand, Truman thought, going back and forth, constantly forcing Vernon backwards, until finally shields met, slowing Truman's offensive assault. Splinters flew off the wooden shields as the two clashed. The warriors separated, casting the now useless shields aside. The shouts of victory still masked the sounds of their conflict. On and on, their battle continued. Steel on steel, a boy fighting to save an entire civilization from its worst enemy. The two would clash and retreat again and again, searching for an opening with which to end the other.
"We've taken the castle, sir,"
a black-clad knight said, drawing his sword as he noticed Truman. "So be it," Prince Vernon said, stepping away from Truman. The two locked eyes for a moment, the anger still playing in their gazes. Sheathing his sword, Prince Vernon walked up the beach. "But sir," the knight inquired, gesturing toward Truman. "Leave him," Prince Vernon replied over his shoulder. Dumbfounded at Prince Vernon's behavior, Truman walked over to Raybolt, who only now had begun to move. "We'll get him one day," Truman said, whispering in the griffin's ear. "He's caused too much pain here." "What?" Raybolt replied softly, a sad note in his voice. The griffin gained his feet, The two of them began walking toward the castle. "Victory!" Prince Vernon said, completing the climb up to the heavily fortified castle, the walls now crumbling ruins in the wake of the battle. He approached Truman's parents, standing in front of the portcullis, who were surrounded by Prince Vernon's royal guards. "Victory!" he repeated, reveling in the defeated looks on their faces. "That son of yours is quite a talented swordsman. He might be useful," Prince Vernon continued, the cruel tone evident in his voice. The two parents stared back at him in rage. "Raise the portcullis!" Two of Prince Vernon's dark knights began cranking on a giant wooden lever, causing the great entryway to open. Prince Vernon stepped inside. Following him, several dark knights forced Truman's mother along with them. They began walking through the dim halls, occasionally illuminated by a flickering candle or torch placed on the wall, which casts eerie shadows across the floor. "Really, brother, you could have kept this place cleaner," Prince Vernon said mockingly. After a few minutes of pure delight with his revenge, Prince Vernon turned to Megan. "Now we can make this easy, or we will have to tear your precious castle apart. Where are the jewels?" For a moment, no one spoke. "Tell me," he said menacingly. Closing her eyes, as if in pain, Megan said quietly, "In the throne room. There's a panel in the wall. The panel is behind the throne itself. Push it and the wall will open. The wall will open into another room. The jewels are in a chest that is clearly visible." Following her instructions, the entire group then went to the throne room. Prince Vernon paused for a moment before pushing the golden panel on the wall, savoring his victory yet again. Pushing the panel, he stepped back as the wall shifted, revealing the room that had been described. Prince Vernon stepped through the opening. Megan could hear the scraping of metal on wood as the latch was undone. Then, a brilliant light filled the room. An evil voice could be heard. "Yes, yes, yes! Bwah, ha, 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 ha. Thank you for listening to Book 1 of the Erion Scrolls, Beyond the Whirlpool, by Tucker Waters. Read to you in its entirety by Phillip Pomeroy.